What a roller coaster of a season the 76ers had. And in my mind, this was one of the most dramatic seasons any team has had in my lifetime. But history may not end up remembering it that way because of the soap operas that took place with the Lakers and the Nets. But if you really start to think back, the way the 76ers season ended 2 years ago with Ben Simmons passing up a layup in game 7, then the aftermath of that elimination, Doc Rivers and Joel Embiid sort of throwing Simmons under the bus, it's really been a crazy couple of years. After that, Simmons ends up demanding a trade, and then there's this weird game of chicken between Daryl Morey and the organization with Ben Simmons and his camp, and that cloud kind of just looms over the whole training camp and the start of the season. And to start the season, at least, it really did have the appearance that both sides had lost this game of chicken and just gotten into a head-on collision. On the Simmons side of things, because he essentially just decided he wasn't going to show up anymore, he ends up losing out on a ton of money. And on the Morey slash 76er side, because Ben Simmons wasn't playing, every day that went by, his perceived trade value was just plummeting. A player who at the beginning of the offseason was being discussed as the centerpiece of a potential Damian Lillard trade, all of a sudden it was pretty unclear as to whether he was even going to be worth CJ McCollum straight up. It looked like just a doomsday scenario for both sides with no end in sight. And then all of a sudden, both sides were thrown this big round life preserver in the form of James Harden right around the trade deadline. A blockbuster deal gets done pretty much right at the deadline, sending Ben Simmons, Seth Curry, Andre Drummond, and 2 firsts to the Nets for James Harden and Paul Millsap. And Morey seemingly pulled it off. He stood up to a star player and he ended up with the guy he wanted all along. All seemed to be right in the world of Philly basketball, at least for a time. The 76ers assumed they were getting the Houston Rockets version of James Harden, the version that went on historic scoring tears, was near at the top of the league for MVP. But what they ended up getting was this slightly pudgy, mostly disinterested version that had clearly lost a step or two. The second big problem was losing Seth Curry and Andre Drummond really depleted the depth on what was already a pretty thin roster. And as crazy as it sounds, Drummond actually a fairly significant loss. For the last few years, by his own choice and for reasons that remain unclear to me, he has chosen to be this really overqualified backup center. And for Philly last season, he Drummond was able to eat up just these large chunks of minutes or even entire games for Joel Embiid to kind of mitigate some of that wear and tear from the regular season. So once he was gone, they didn't have that. And on the back half of the season, Embiid was playing big minutes, big demanding minutes at that. And entering the playoffs, 76ers fans were extremely optimistic. They thought Harden was going to get it back together. Embiid was playing at a transcendent level. They thought they were in the mix for the title. And in the opening series against the Raptors, or at least at the start of that series, it looked like that best case scenario was playing out. They jump off to a 3-0 lead, but that's where the entire playoff run for them just completely unravels. The Raptors ended up battling back to force a game 6. And I might be misremembering this, but in that game 6, I remember that being a pretty close game at halftime. It looked like Doc and Harden were just going to have another epic playoff meltdown, letting the Raptors pull off the reverse sweep from down 3-0. But Philly was able to get it back together and put the Raptors away in the second half of that game, but it wasn't without costs. Late into that game, in that blowout, Joel Embiid caught an elbow from Pascal Siakam, suffered a concussion and an orbital fracture, and that made him unavailable for the start of the Miami series. And this was the moment that the 76ers really missed Andre Drummond. At that point in the game, you would have liked to have put your star player on the bench, but without a viable backup in the game, not totally out of reach, Doc didn't feel comfortable doing that. And this is the moment that you acquire a guy like James Harden for. And this is where he's supposed to show up big, back against the wall, against a superior team. A guy and a player of Harden's stature is supposed to at least be able to steal one game without Joel Embiid, but he was pretty much a no-show for the entire series except for game 4. And that just includes an all-time stinker in game 6. I think the worst part really just comes down to his effort. As a Philly fan or just an NBA fan in general, I think all that we can ask from these guys is that they lay it out all out on the line. Guys are going to miss shots, they're going to make mistakes, but if the effort is there, I don't think we can ask for a whole lot more. And that's what's so infuriating about particularly that second half of that game 6. I'm not even sure Harden broke a sweat out there. He walked up and down the court and only attempted two shots in the second half of a closeout game in the playoffs. And if I can find the clip, I'm going to throw it up because down the stretch of that game, Harden failed to meet a pass from Maxey. And then I think the next trip down, he gets his pocket picked by Bam. Both plays, Harden didn't even pretend to get back. And Tyrese Maxey absolutely lost his mind. And I don't blame him. As hilarious as it was, I still don't blame him. Harden is a guy that Maxey likely looked up to, and he was a guy that was just named to the All NBA 75 team. And to see that level of effort and lack of care in such a big moment, it would drive anyone crazy. So the last two playoff runs, Simmons passes up a wide open layup, and Harden just lays a stinker in game 6. Two soul crushing ways to lose in the playoffs with a whole bunch of drama in between. And with Harden slotted to be a free agent, it seemed like the drama would continue, but thankfully for the 76ers, that wouldn't be the case. Harden very quietly signed a team friendly extension. He turned down his $47 million player option for next year and instead signed a deal worth $34 million next year and 36 the following year. And with that extra money, the 76ers were able to round out this roster and plug some of the holes that they had last season, which pretty much leads us to today. The Philly over-under is 49.5, and let's just get out of the way. That's a slam dunk in my mind. Last season, Philly managed to win 51 games despite all the drama and Embiid missing time and having to integrate another star player in James Harden and a really difficult star player to integrate at that. They really only lost Danny Green, DeAndre Jordan, and Paul Millsap this offseason. And I would argue that only really Danny Green belongs in an actual NBA rotation at this stage. And they replaced them with DeAnthony Melton, a really strong defensive guard, PJ Tucker, a defender who can guard 1 through 5, hit some corner threes, Daniel House, solid shooter, and Montrezl Harrell, who while is a bit undersized at the center spot and a bit of a defensive liability, I think he's going to be able to eat up those minutes in those games where you want to rest Embiid. He's become a bit underrated in my mind. He's still a really good athlete who can run the floor, and he can absolutely fill it up scoring wise. They also still have Tyrese Maxey, who's going to be entering his third season of the league as he starts to potentially enter that all-star conversation. They still have Tobias Harris, who I also think has become a bit underrated. Sure, he's really hot and cold, and that contract is just insane. But as a basketball player, he's a big wing, solid defender, and a 3-level scorer. Harris doesn't show up every night, but when he does, it looks great. And so with all those additions and what is already on the roster, also having a full training camp to integrate James Harden, it seems fairly obvious to me that this is at least a 50-win team, barring just a complete disaster. But are they a finals contender, and how long is the championship window open? I think it's fairly unlikely that they're competing for a title. There's just too many question marks for me. And for me to get there with them to that championship level, they have to get the Heat version of PJ Tucker. They have to rebuild Matisse Thybulle's confidence. Tyrese Maxey has to kind of continue his ascendance. They have to get a fully locked in and in shape version of James Harden, and they're going to need another transcendent year out of Joel Embiid. Oh, and also Doc Rivers can't be a complete dunce. Some of those things are more realistic than others, but if they get that perfect scenario, I think they can absolutely compete for a title. I just don't know how realistic getting all of that is. And if it is going to happen, it needs to happen this year for them. I do think Maxey is going to continue to take the next step into becoming a star player. I think Thibault is going to get his mojo back, but the rest of it, I'm not sure about. With regards to Embiid, I've talked about multiple times on this podcast. The end of his prime is coming sooner rather than later. He's going to be 29 next season, and history tells us guys his size aren't transcendent much past the age of 30. Both Shaq and David Robinson's last great year came at the age of 30, and while I think Embiid is still going to be one of the best players in the league next season, the next phase of his career is coming. It's just a matter of when. Can James Harden realistically turn back the clock? I know the social media posts say he's gotten back into shape, but history tells us once these score first guards lose that first step, they don't get it back. There just isn't a precedent for a player like James Harden of that stature to fall off a cliff production wise and then all of a sudden turn back into the prime version of themselves after a couple years. But maybe all those Instagram photos are true. Maybe the hamstring injury he suffered in the 21 season really did prevent him from getting into shape for the 2022 season. I doubt it, but maybe. PJ Tucker is another huge question mark. They signed him to a 3 year, $33 million deal. And are we sure they're getting the Miami version of him? First off, he's 37 years old. So, how much longer is he going to be an elite defender in the league? Also, Eric Spoelstra is one of the best coaches in the league with a really sophisticated movement based offense that creatively put PJ Tucker in places where he could be effective. They created chances for him to set tons of screens, hit backdoor cutters, get floaters in the lane, not just having him stand in the corner. They really got him moving off the ball. So, are we sure Doc Rivers is going to be able to get that version of PJ Tucker? I can easily see Doc Rivers just parking him in the corner, and it's going to be such a waste of a lot of the things that PJ Tucker does well. The Heat have also shown that they can squeeze the last bit of basketball life out of these older players. The prior season, the Heat started Goran Dragic and Trevor Ariza. Andre Iguodala was a huge part of the rotation, and they made the playoffs. The year before that, they made the finals with Goran Dragic as the leading scorer in the playoffs for them. And again, Andre Iguodala is a key part of the rotation. Fast forward to last season, Dragic is a buyout guy who barely plays for the Nets, and Iguodala and Ariza look just totally unplayable. So I think it's possible that this is just another case of Miami getting the last bit of basketball out of a veteran player. Then you've got to look at PJ Tucker's 3-point shooting. Last year, he had a career year as far as 3-point percentage goes. He was leading the league at one point in 3-point percentage. So I think it's safe to say that that season of shooting for him was an anomaly rather than the new rule, just because it was so far removed from any of the other seasons he's had. Moving on to Doc Rivers, I've made my feelings on him as a coach quite clear. I'll go ahead and link the two videos I did discussing, the Philadelphia 76ers elimination from the playoffs last year, and then the news that he was named to the list of all-time coaches. So if you want more on him, check those out. I just don't think that he's a very good coach, to keep it short. There are some really great coaches out east. So with the chips down in the playoffs, I just can't see him winning these really tough coaching matchups when they need him to. And honestly, I could see Daryl Morey firing him if the 76ers get off to a slow start this season. So maybe come playoff time, he's not a factor anymore. So while it's obvious to take the over at 49.5 wins, I think they're pretty unlikely to make a title run this year or even the conference finals, barring some massive changes trade wise or some unprecedented event regarding James Harden or Joel Embiid. I don't see them winning one in the near future either. And won't that be just this extremely unceremonious end to the process? I'm sure there will be documentaries made about it someday.